Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Our next guest is returning to Boom and Bust to discuss areas where government policies have relentlessly driven up prices for Canadian consumers. Please welcome back Colin Craig, who is the president of Second Street, a Canadian think tank. Welcome back, Colin.
Well, thanks for having me, Tony.
So I guess as a prelude to getting into some detail, why don't you describe and define the challenges that the Canadian economy is facing right now?
Well, I think certainly all of your viewers will know that the cost of living has gone up significantly over the past several years. Inflation is much higher than what the Bank of Canada's target inflation rate has traditionally been in that 2 to 3% range. And so when prices of a lot of the things we buy keep going up faster than our paychecks, then that obviously causes a lot of hardship for Canadian families and also businesses too. So that's probably the number one factor that we consistently hear about is that a lot of Canadian families are struggling, and it's making it hard for people to get by. So, with that being said, you don't want the government interfering too much in the economy, but I think there's a number of things the government could be doing right now in the opposite direction, and that is to kind of step back and look at ways that they can help reduce prices for Canadian consumers.
Yeah, let's draw that out a little bit. The connection between government policies impacting consumer prices. Can you explain that to the audience?
Yeah, so there's several ways where governments interfere in different sectors. And when they do this, they're limiting competition. And when you limit competition, that traditionally, causes an upward pressure on prices. It's good for consumers when there's a lot of businesses competing to provide them with the products that they want. I mean, if you think about something like the restaurant sector, it's a good example where there's pretty good competition. In most cities, you can choose from hundreds of possibilities in terms of where you're going to go for your lunch or your supper or whatever. And each of those businesses have to compete with each other to provide consumers with the products that they want at a good price. And obviously, it's not always perfect, but there's a lot of choice there for consumers. If you look at some sectors, we don't see that happening because the government is limiting competition. So that's not a good thing. If you look at the airline sector as one example, federal policy in the aviation sector does not allow foreign carriers to come into Canada and transport people between Canadian cities. So if you're in, say, Toronto, you can take maybe a Korean Airlines flight outside of the country, but you couldn't take a Korean Airlines flight from, say, Toronto to Vancouver. They're not allowed to do that. And so when you're limiting the competition between our domestic routes, it, like I say, it ultimately has an upward pressure on prices. So the government's actually contributing to higher costs in the aviation sector. And this form of limitation takes place in that the government, through legislation, does not allow foreign businesses to own more than 49% of an airline that operates domestically in Canada. So that rule limits how many different choices are available to Canadian consumers. And like I said, ultimately leads to higher prices.
And that's unusual in world markets, like this system that is set up in Canada that limits the competition for domestic flights. That's not usual in countries.
I'm not sure. You might even have a bit of insight into this, Tony, because of course you were elected at the federal level. So jump in if I've made any mistakes here. But whether it happens in other countries or not, I think the bigger problem is why would we impose a policy in Canada that's going to restrict competition for consumers? And in this case, I don't think there's a very good argument for it. There may be a desire to limit certain countries from operating in Canada for national security reasons.
Right.
But I think certainly it would be beneficial and wise to let American carriers into Canada, like I say, Korean Airlines in, Japan Airlines in, and so forth, countries that are considered to be Canadian allies. You could certainly do that. And where there are barriers in those countries, perhaps to Canadian companies operating domestically, well, then maybe they would tear down their barriers too. And then ultimately consumers in both nations would benefit.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Colin. It is a matter of negotiation with other countries, and if we get more of a blue sky here, then we can have access to more of their area as well. We're going to take a little break from Colin. We're going to have our messages. We'll be back after these messages. Please stay with us.